Hey YouTube, what's up? Here I go with another one of them stories. But before I begin, I need y'all to like, comment, share this video, and subscribe to my channel at Forensic 8888. Also, shout out to Dante and the whole Dante Show network, yo. So, I'm about to get into it. This is the Comfort Girl Part 2. So, before leaving the room, Dr. Lee looked at Young with a blank expression, but deep down she felt bad for the woman. Young was moved from the third floor to the second floor, and Dr. Lee was trying to get her down to the first floor, like just to do laundry. See, Dr. Lee knew that Young wasn't going to last long, or she would have to go to the dungeon. So when the Eon fools are undesirable, really sick, or disobedient, they have to go to the dungeon. Usually heroin didn't make the women look like zombies right away, but with Young it was much different. Dr. Lee noticed that within a few weeks Young looked horrible. She believed her body was rejecting the heroin and her organs were shutting down quicker than usual. And this was in the 1930s and 1940s, and they didn't have as much information on heroin as we do now. But anyway, Dr. Lee wasn't sure if it was an allergic reaction or what, but she knew the dungeon was no place for an animal, let alone a human being. And the sight of Young made Dr. Lee think about the recent conversation she had with the lieutenant. So one day, Dr. Lee asked if Young could work in the laundry room. And the lieutenant just stared at her like, "Why?" So she was trying her best not to show any emotion or sympathy. So Dr. Lee lied and she was like, Young was bad for business, and she heard the customers complaining about how she looks. Then she said the older madams could use someone younger to help them in the laundry room so the clothes could get done faster. And while Dr. Lee was talking, Lieutenant Munatu looked at her and pretended to play a sad song on his little invisible violin, like he really did not care. So when she saw what he was doing, she got quiet and waited for him to finish his little imaginary solo. So then the lieutenant laughed at Dr. Lee because he knew she had a soft spot for the women, and he knew she pretended not to care, but he didn't say anything about it. Like, unbeknownst to anyone, he actually had a soft spot for her too. But unlike her, he didn't let his emotions show. So the lieutenant answer was no. He said, "Although I don't owe you an explanation, you should know that some of the men have a fetish for women that look like death. Her bruises turn them on, so I don't care if the soldiers stick it to every single hole in her arm. Young makes me money, which keep this place up and running. And the children can help the madams, but since I have a big heart, I'll make a deal with you." So when he said that, this made Dr. Lee perk up a little bit, like knowing she could save Young's life. So the lieutenant held his face in his hands like this, like he was a little schoolgirl admiring someone. So he said, if you want her to work in the laundry room, then go pick out one of the 10-year-old boys or girls to replace her. He or she will service the men on the third floor. And when their young holes are all worn out, I'll let them work with the madams instead of them going to the second floor of the dungeon. And that was messed up, but he was like, "Well, the choice is yours, little Lee," instead of calling her Dr. Lee. Like, he was just so disrespectful to her. So she bit her tongue and said nothing. Dr. Lee knew the lieutenant very well, so she knew he was serious. He walked over to where the medicine cart was, grabbed an apple, bit into it, and said, "Well, if you have nothing else to discuss, the meeting over with." So just then, Dr. Lee dismissed the meeting out of her head and she got back to work. When it was time to go to the third room, Dr. Lee told Nari to wait for her down the hall. And Nari didn't question it. But she was thinking in her head, like, who was in those rooms? So while she was waiting for Dr. Lee, one of the soldiers caught her attention. He stared at her in the eyes and kept nodding his head towards the closet. And she looked back at him confused, like she didn't understand what he was trying to tell her. So the soldier took his left hand, grabbed his crotch, started pumping his pelvis in the air, and then with his right hand, he was, pointing back and forth between himself and Nari. So he was gesturing for them to go in the closet and have sex. And mind you, this girl about 12 years old. So when she saw this, she looked at him with a mean ass mug and balled up her fist And then all of a sudden, the soldier looked terrified, like he just seen the devil. His whole demeanor changed. And then the soldier put his head down and turned away from her. When Nari saw this reaction, she looked at him. She nodded her head like, yeah, that's what I thought. And then she puffed out her little 12-year-old chest or whatever. But what she didn't know was Sergeant Tino was down the hall looking at them, like he saw all of this, and the soldier saw him. So once he saw the soldier back down, he went into one of the rooms. And although they were selling women and the other comfort stations sold their children, he knew Sergeant Tino didn't want the soldiers messing with the kids. When Dr. Lee came out of that room, she told Nari, we need to move quickly. It's almost time for the soldiers to come, and we have not reached the 3rd floor. So they finished up the 2nd floor, and then they hopped on the elevator and headed up to the 3rd floor. Dr. Lee told her, tonight is a special night. The Eon Fu on the 2nd floor will service the soldiers. The Eon Fu on the 3rd floor will service the high-ranking men and the government officials. They pay more money for these women, so we have to make sure everything is perfect for them. So when they stepped off the elevator onto the 3rd floor, everything was fine. Like, the atmosphere didn't feel so intense. She heard laughing. She saw women walking around freely. And these women wore lingerie. Their hair was brushed and they smelled like perfume. They were eating fresh fruit and nobody was tied to the bed. She also noticed that they weren't Chinese or Korean like the other women. And there was a couple other races in there also. But these women were Japanese. And they were allowed to choose what they wanted from the cart. So each woman received 3 cigarettes, 2 new condoms, a clean washcloth, and some peppermints. And they could choose whether they wanted a shot of liquor, heroin, or the pills. So they had a choice. A lot of women chose the syringe, but she remembered one young girl named Suki chose the pill. Like, she looked at Nari and then chose the pill. So when Dr. Lee and Nari got back to the medicine room, Dr. Lee fed Nari some rice cakes and water, and she refilled the medicine cart. Then she told Nari to finish her meal quickly before they headed to the dungeon. As they were getting on the elevator, Dr. Lee looked at Nari and said, listen, this is what separates the women from the children. No matter what you see, do not look surprised. Don't hesitate. Don't ever get caught showing any emotions. Everyone is watching you, including the soldiers. Show no fear. Show no mercy. Nari knew she was a tough little girl because the soldiers kidnapped her, brought them to Japan, separated her from her mother, exposed her to the medicine duty. She stood up to a soldier, and she was the only child picked to do this work. And she never broke down or folded. So in her mind, she felt like she was tougher than everybody else. And what Dr. Lee was saying, like, really didn't apply to her. So this is what she was thinking. And then they rode the elevator down to the dungeon. Y'all, the dungeon was hell. You could smell it before you got off the elevator. It smelled like death and gym socks. And the noises she heard would give her nightmares. The dogs were barking and panting. She heard men yelling, women crying, people moaning, chains clanking, metal sharpening, and some other things she couldn't even describe. So the dungeon had many rooms to service, and each room had a different scene in it. There was sodomy, bestiality, graping, cannibalism, role playing with costumes, a midget and a mouse and a man in clown makeup throwing rocks at one of the Eon Fu. So, and some other stuff too. But what really made her sick was the women that looked like young. There were 4 women who looked like they had diseases. And although the women were dying slowly, men still wanted service from them. It was nasty. Like, one of the Eon Fu had pus coming out of her sores, and she smelled like bad seafood. So Nari stood there in shock. Like, not because the pus was coming out of the woman's arm, and not because she smelled bad. It was because she was in a trance and bent over like in a dope fiend lean. But she wouldn't fall. So y'all know how the dope fiends be, or how they used to be. They'll bend, but they would not fall. So, and behind her was a man with a mask and a kitchen smock on, helping himself to her services. So you know what I'm talking about. And Nari was in a daze, and she didn't even hear the doctor yelling at her. But the masked man heard the doctor, so he kept on doing what he was doing, looking at Nari and laughing. Then he pointed towards Dr. Lee. As soon as Nari turned to see what he was pointing at, a hand slapped her face. Dr. Lee slapped Nari, grabbed her by her shirt and collar, and then pulled her up out of the room. And then she started yelling, "Choo-choo, choo-choo." And although Nari was Korean, she knew that that meant to focus in Japanese. Then she really looked at Dr. Lee and noticed her Japanese features. Dr. Lee asked Nari, did she want to die? So Nari looked at her, frowned, and said, "Chuyu gegada, chuyu gegada." And Dr. Lee was a little taken back by her answer. Nari just told her to go to hell. And Dr. Lee didn't know how to respond. She just let go of Nari's shirt and stared at her. So Nari fixed her shirt, grabbed the medicine cart, and headed down towards the next room. And this time Dr. Lee followed behind her. And at that moment, she gained respect from Dr. Lee and the soldiers that were watching. So since these women in the dungeon were already servicing their customers, they already started on their customers, Nari left them a heroin-filled needle, antibiotics, a condom, and a peppermint. She knows she wasn't supposed to get them no peppermint nor a condom. So Nari was told, like, don't bother leaving the condoms or antibiotics on the dresser, because the men in the dungeon can use the old ones, and the women's bodies will eventually get used to the antibiotics and the medicine not going to work anymore. But Nari did it anyway. She didn't care. And for some reason, Dr. Lee didn't even say anything about it. Oddly, the little brave girl gave her some hope, and Dr. Lee put her plan back in motion. So Nari was happy, like they were headed back towards the elevator, because the smell of the dungeon made her nauseous. And although the young girl wasn't tired, she wanted to go to sleep just so she could forget about what happened today. So now I'm going to talk about what happened when Dr. Lee slapped her. Y'all, she didn't want to slap Nari, but when Nari started staring at the customers for too long, Dr. Lee peeped how the soldiers were looking at her. And one of them was about to approach this little girl. So Dr. Lee had to act quickly. These soldiers were violent, and she felt like the slap to the face would make them happy enough to keep their mouth shut. And the soldier who was about to approach Nari was Officer Katsu. And he was one of the officers in charge of the dungeon. He knew that she was the new girl, so he wasn't going to kill her. He was just going to rough her up a little bit. He also knew that his team was watching him, so he had to save his behind also. Officer Katsu was glad when Dr. Lee stepped in, because he didn't really want to do anything to Nari. And Officer Katsu had a crush on Dr. Lee, so he just kind of let it slide. When he saw that she had everything under control, he was satisfied. But if it ever happened again, he would have no choice but to tell the lieutenant, because one of the rules is that you can't make the same mistake twice. So anyway, when they reached the first floor, they went inside of the medicine room to return the cart. And Dr. Lee decided that she was going to explain to Nari why she slapped her. As she started talking to Nari, Nari cut her off and was like, I'm not as naive as you think. I know I messed up, and you did what you had to do in order to save us. I understand that, but I have questions for you. So Dr. Lee was a little taken back by this little girl. She reminded her of a warrior, not a child. And Dr. Lee never thought that she would have the answer to a little minor, but she felt like Nari deserved to know what was going on. So Nari said, we have been on every floor, and I haven't seen my mother, which leads me to believe that when you made me wait in the hallway and you went inside those two rooms, one of those rooms held my mother inside. Is she okay? So Dr. Lee said, yes, she's fine. And I did not want to take you in the room because I knew after you saw your mother, you would lose focus. So Nari nodded her head again and agreed with the doctor. Then she said, well, I'm stronger now and I would like to see her. So y'all stick around for part 3. But before I leave, I want everybody to read about the comfort women and the comfort stations that were built in Asia between 1932 and 1945 during World War II. Also, like, comment, subscribe to my channel.